Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us in this webinar. My name's Sandell. I'll be your host for today's webinar, and this webinar is all about creating jobs and restoring the environment in a post-COVID world. So thank you everyone around Victoria, Melbourne, wherever you are, for joining us. We've got some wonderful guests for you today to talk about, in this COVID world and this post-COVID world, how do we not only recover from COVID, but also help solve some of the other problems that we know existed in our society beforehand, particularly in relation to the environment and nature. The Greens MPs in Victoria have been running a series of these webinars. We've done one on climate change and renewable energy. We've done one on transport, housing, and this is the one that we're focusing today, particularly on the environment and also our waste and recycling crisis. So thank you for joining us, and before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Wurundjeri country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, acknowledging that we are all on stolen land. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded, and the fight for First Nations justice is something that the Greens continue to fight for. So we thought it might be a good thing, if you know which country you're coming to us from, you might like to acknowledge that in the chat. So housekeeping, we will be recording this webinar for anyone who is unable to make it. Please add your comments and questions in the Zoom chat. So for those who are not Zoom experts, as so many of us have become, there should be a little chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You should be able to put in any comments and questions you have there. We will keep a track of those, and we'll have a question and answer for all the panelists right at the end, and we'll try and get to as many of those questions as you can, and we'll be finishing up by 1 o'clock. So I have put you all on mute, just so that we don't have interruptions during the speakers, but there will be that chance to ask questions at the end. So this is how it will run today. So a quick welcome, and then we're very, very fortunate today to be joined by Minister Eugenie Sage. And Eugenie is an MP for the Greens in New Zealand. And we know that New Zealand has been in a coalition government with Labor over there, and the New Zealand Greens MPs have been able to achieve some incredible things. Eugenie is also the Conservation Minister and has been able to deliver a quite extraordinary package of nature jobs around this COVID time. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Eugenie about how they were able to achieve that and what we might be able to learn here in Australia from that. Just a note also that that voting actually in the New Zealand election is open now for New Zealand expats who might be living in Australia. So if you do know any New Zealand friends and family who are living here, remind them to vote in that incredibly important upcoming election. So we're also very fortunate today to be joined by Councillor Mark Riley. Mark is a Greens councillor in Moreland, in the inner north of Melbourne, and Moreland has really led the way as a council in terms of helping with the recycling revolution and helping solve our waste crisis that was such a big part of our politics over the last couple of years when China stopped taking our recycling. And local councils, particularly councils like Moreland, where we've had a strong Greens presence, have done a remarkable job at transforming the waste system. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Mark, about how you've been able to do that. And also a reminder that there are local government elections in Victoria right now. And so you can re-elect Mark and his colleagues. Wherever you are in Victoria, there'll be a Greens councillor that you can vote for to help us continue that important work. And I'll also make a few mentions of the Victorian Greens plan that we've developed to help create nature jobs and protect our environment and revolutionise waste in light of the COVID crisis. And then we'll leave time for your questions. So we start off with a very special guest, Eugenie Sage. She's the Minister for Conservation, Minister for Land Information and Associate Minister for the Environment and Waste in the New Zealand Parliament. And of course, in New Zealand, the Greens have been in a confidence and supply agreement with Labor to form government, and those three Greens ministers and their other Greens MPs colleagues have been able to achieve an incredible amount since they were elected just a few years ago. So we are very, very fortunate to have her join us now.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Koutou, e mihi ana ki Ranganui Rawako Papatuanuku. Thank you, Ellen, for your introduction. I'm coming to you from Aoteroa, the biggest city in Te Waipounamu, the South Island of Aoteroa, New Zealand. And really delighted by this invitation because really early on in becoming a minister, I visited several states in Australia and had a look at your container return schemes, and that's really inspired some of the work that we're doing in the waste space. So really pleased to be able to talk a bit today about what we've done in government. Could we have the next slide, please, Ellen? Thanks. So one of the key things was that under the former National or Conservative government, we'd had major funding cuts in response to the global financial crisis for government agencies generally, both across social services, but also to the Department of Conservation, which is charged with looking after our national parks, reserves, marine reserves, and about a third of the Aotearoa New Zealand land area, which is protected, public protected land. So there'd been the loss of several hundred staff, and the department was in quite a bad way. We have in New Zealand a nature crisis, as in many other parts of the world, and about 4,000 species are threatened or at risk of extinction. So it was one of the priorities of the Greens in government to increase the funding for Te Papa Atawhai, which is the Indigenous name for the Department of Conservation, to enable it to work to protect those species and to invest much more in looking after protected lands and waters. So we did that in Budget 2017 and also 2018, where the Greens pushed for and achieved a $35 levy on every international visitor, except Australians, because you've got residency when you land in New Zealand. But that was a recognition that tourism, until COVID, was our number one industry and to export industry, and to enable visitors to contribute to looking after the places that they came to see and enjoy. This international tourism and conservation levy, half of the revenue would go for conservation and half of it for better tourism planning. And so that was an estimated extra 40 million annually. But of course, with COVID, the borders closed and the visitors are no longer coming. So with because tourism's been such a major industry, with COVID, there have been a lot of pressure, and a lot of the tourism operators have been doing it extremely hard. And so in order to respond to job losses, because we had, it's just come to an end, a big wage subsidy scheme in New Zealand, which has supported a lot of businesses and enabled staff to continue to be employed and to provide for whānau needs. But the Greens pushed really hard as part of our budget for an investment in nature. And it partly came off the back of a traditional response in the early part of the recovery package by investing in hard infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure. And we were quite critical, Julianne Genter, our Associate Transport Minister, was quite critical of the bias towards roading and the failure to invest adequately in public and active transport. So in terms of preparing for the budget, we did much as you're doing now with your series of seminars. We ran a lot of webinars, really launched our push for part of the COVID response and recovery package had to be a significant investment in papatūānuku or nature. And the reason for that was partly because tourism depends on healthy nature. We all do for our well-being, and also because our other major export industries in food and fibre have depended on our 100% pure clean green reputation internationally. But we haven't been investing enough to give that reputation integrity, and for nature's own sake as well. So COVID in Aoteroa involved quite a major shifting of what was, because our budget normally comes out in May, and preparation for that normally starts about September, October. So quite late in the piece, around sort of late March, April, there was a major reshaping, and the Greens went all out to push for a major investment in Jobs for Nature, which was a title that we developed. And so this is started with the 1st of July after our budget, 1.3 billion NZ to create 11,000 jobs over 4 years, working alongside iwi, Indigenous Māori, working alongside the regional councils, and increasing the funds for community organisations to apply for as well. It's involving cooperation by 4 government agencies: Environment, Primary Industries, Land Information and Department of Conservation, which is quite new for them to have to cooperate at this scale. So that there have been a few teething issues. But we are investing in jobs, particularly in pest and weed control, because of the abundance of introduced pests we have in New Zealand: possums from you, rats, stoats, pigs, feral cats, goats, and particularly the mustelids, the rats, the ferrets, the weasels and the stoats have a major impact on our bird life. So doing quite a lot of trapping, investing in new technology to help that, wild and conifer control, planting in riparian areas to help improve the quality of waterways. So those programs are being rolled out at the moment. There are a couple of thousand people that have been able to get employment. And just one recently was, there's a rafting company in Murchison in the northern South Island. So with the closure of borders, they don't have clients anymore. So there was some funding given to a backcountry trust, which is a community organisation which repairs and restores huts in the backcountry, which are less of a priority for DOC because they don't have the same visitation as some of the front country huts. So these rafting guides were using their outdoor skills and experience to work with a skilled builder to repair and restore some of these huts. So it's a major benefit for recreation, for conservation, as well as ensuring that they're bringing home a salary or wages each week to provide for their livelihoods. Next slide. Thanks, Ellen. The other area that we have put quite an effort into is in waste, and I think there's another slide, or there should be. Oh, thanks. And so this has been again, with the COVID recovery package, we have got 124 million being invested in new recycling infrastructure. And because under national, there was very little use of our Waste Minimisation Act the Greens chose waste as a specific portfolio to get as ministers, and I knew nothing about waste really when I became minister 3 years ago, but it's been part of our kaupapa for a long time, and so we've really focused on that. And I think one plaudits from businesses, the sector, local government for the big investment here to actually really reduce waste to landfill. So we've got a lot of catching up to do with Australia, where your landfill levy is much higher than ours. So we're expanding that. We've banned single-use plastic bags. We're introducing a container deposit scheme, or designing that at the moment. We're moving to mandatory product stewardship for problem products like tyres, electronic waste, and we're getting councils to work together to standardise curbside collection, both in the materials that they collect, and we're phasing out some of the harder to recycle plastics, things like the 3, 4, 6 and 7. And just having councils work together makes it more effective for the operators. Having councils agree to separate glass out gives a higher quality of materials to recycle, and having more consistent contracts across the sector as well also is likely to encourage the operators. So we've got a goal in our green policy, which we launched recently for this election, to avoid, phase out, have zero food waste to landfill, zero electronic waste to landfill, and to substantially reduce volumes of other waste to landfill and significantly increase the materials that are recycled. The container return scheme, I think Victoria is the only state in Australia which is sort of yet to get one. We're about a bit further ahead of Victoria, I think, but we've really taken a lot of advice from New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia to look at what are the best elements of those schemes to design one that works really well for Aoteroa New Zealand, but also recognises a lot of the trans-Tasman businesses producing beverages. And it's been really, banning single-use plastic bags was one of the first things we did, but it's been hugely symbolic and really supported by New Zealanders of just a real desire to reduce and avoid waste. And then a lot of folk doing beach cleanups now say that they very rarely see those plastic shopping bags on the beach. They still see a lot of other plastic waste, but we're tackling that. So happy to answer any questions later on, but thank you, Ellen, and back to you.
Thank you, Eugenie. It's really inspiring for me to hear what you've been able to achieve, and you've learned a little bit from some of our states, and then you've pushed ahead and done a lot more, and hopefully Victoria can even follow that, and we can just feed off each other to get better policy and programs in these sectors. So I just wanted to say Eugenie will be here to answer questions at the end, so please put your questions in the chat and I'll pick up on those at the end. I just wanted to talk you through now our plan in Victoria, the Victorian Greens plan for nature jobs here to help us recover from COVID. We obviously have the same issues as many places all around the world have in terms of the need for jobs and the harm that COVID has done to our economy, the harm that it's done to tourism, but also on top of that we have this added layer of the huge bushfires that went through around New Year's Eve and how devastating that was, particularly to our forests and particularly in Victoria. So the Greens have come up with a plan which would create 11,000 jobs, so about the same as what you've created in New Zealand, Eugenie. 11,000 jobs, particularly for young people in rural communities. Young people we know are the cohort that has been most affected in the COVID crisis. And also our plan includes planting 500,000 trees a year over the next 10 years. It also includes some of those elements that Eugenie was talking about in terms of managing weeds and invasive species. After climate change, weeds and invasive species is the biggest environmental threat that we're facing here in Victoria. And our plan also includes funding for a program that already exists but is running out of money, which is around fencing rivers and waterways to keep out stock and keep those waterways healthy. Sounds like New Zealand is doing something very similar. So I just wanted to talk you through what the 500,000 trees program is, because when we talk to people about this, people say, well, how did you choose 500,000 and where would you plant them and how would you do it? This is actually, we've based this on a plan that already actually exists called the Resilient Melbourne Plan. And it's a plan that was developed by government it had a target in there to have 40% canopy cover of native species across Greater Melbourne. The problem is, it was a great plan. The problem is the government never funded it. And so it's really just sitting on the shelf there, doing not very much. But 40% canopy cover for Greater Melbourne, plus we think we can do more in the regions, particularly in bushfire affected regions, by giving money primarily to councils to do this work, because councils will be best placed to understand what native species in their area need to be planted where, whether that's in council-owned land or whether that's on state government land, whether that's along waterways or whether it's in parks. Councils all pretty much have targets, but they need the money to assist them to actually meet those targets of planting those trees and other native vegetation. So if we can fund the Resilient Melbourne Plan and supplement that with funding for councils in other local government areas in regional and rural Victoria, we can reach this 500,000 trees or other native vegetation a year over the next 10 years, which would go a long way to helping us deal with climate change, but also helping with some of the other environmental issues that we have. So our plan is the trees program, 500,000 trees a year, plus a huge program of investment in Parks Victoria to create those 11,000 jobs to do weed and invasive species, plus the funding for fencing rivers to keep out stock, which is an existing program. So this is what we think as a start the Victorian government could do right off the back in this budget coming up in October. Of course, we also have a renewables plan, which is separate to this. We've done a separate webinar on this, so I won't go into it in as much detail, but we do have a huge plan of how the government could do more in renewable energy in Victoria. The government here has been decent at renewable energy, but there are some very big missing gaps as well. So we need to build more large-scale wind, solar and energy storage projects. We need to upgrade our energy grid and actually bring it back into public hands. There's a lot of renewables being held back because our grid is not fit for purpose. We need to revive manufacturing in Victoria, which could create jobs by doing things like the Portland aluminium smelter. If we ran that on clean energy and actually retrofitted it so it was like some other plants around the world who have done this, it could actually act like a reverse battery where it scales down its use on days when other people are using high energy, on summer days, for example, and scales up when the rest of Victoria isn't using so much energy. And that acts like a reverse battery in the Victorian system. And we also know that we need to weatherproof every Victorian home. We've got a very large program that the government could roll out right now around energy efficiency. We've all been stuck in our freezing homes over winter with COVID, trying to work from home. We all know that our homes are pretty inefficient and very expensive to heat, and we could change that. We also would like to see solar and batteries on every public housing home. We know that public housing we need to build more public housing, but we also need to make those homes affordable and appropriate for the people who live in them. So this is our plan. I'm just going to do a little bit of audience participation now. So I'll ask Steph, who's our tech support, to put a bit of a poll up on the screen. And if everyone could take a quick look at this poll. This poll, what is the most important thing you think the Victorian government could do to stimulate jobs while restoring the environment and protect native wildlife? So I'll give you just 30 seconds now to put in your answers. We've got 60% of people voted, I can see. Here we are, and here are the results. I guess no surprises that most people, 60%, think that we should do all of the above, but stopping logging native forests was also high up there as well, to deal with climate change and stop invasive weeds and species, absolutely. So as many of you would know, we still log our native forests here in Victoria, and of course invasive weeds and species is also a huge threat to our environment along with climate change. So we do need to do all of these. The second last option on here is invest in targeted recovery programs for endangered species. And I just want to put in a plug for this one, because here in Victoria, we have a few nature laws that stop big corporations from destroying native habitat, but actually the government doesn't really enforce them. And we have a list of threatened and critically endangered species in Victoria, but the government doesn't have a plan really for what to do about them. This is in contrast to even the New South Wales government, who also has a lot of problem with anti-environment governments. But in New South Wales, they actually have a huge $100 million program called Save Our Species, which actually lists all the endangered species and targeted programs the government is doing to assist them. So that whether that's revegetation work or captive breeding or whatever it might be, we don't actually have that in Victoria. And so we also have a plan to invest more in those targeted recovery programs to make sure that those species are safe while we're dealing with some of the bigger systemic issues like climate change. The Greens have just announced that we've put through the Parliament an inquiry into how those programs might work. So towards the end, I'll show you a link, we'll put it in the chat now as well. If you'd like to be part of that process, that parliamentary inquiry into how we can do better for the environment in Victoria, we encourage you to do so. So, enough from me. Now we are going to move on to Councillor Mark Riley from Moreland. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark, to have a bit of a chat about what Moreland's been able to achieve in the waste space.
Thank you, Ellen, and it's great to have Eugenie, and thanks for joining. I am acknowledging that I'm on Wurundjeri Wurrung land today in Bullock area or Brunswick area, which is just, as Ellen said earlier, north of Metro Melbourne. So we border onto the city of Moreland, city of Yarra almost, and a little bit of the city of Melbourne to our south. There's about 180,000 residents here, and I just want to acknowledge all of the Indigenous people who live in this city and other First Nations people in the room and in the chat today or online with the seminar. I also want to acknowledge the loss and the grief that COVID has brought upon our communities and caused many people. I'm sure some of you may know those who've suffered with it and losses there, but also the social and wellbeing impacts that our communities do, and local governments have been doing a lot to try and address some of that through food packaging, trying to get people connected online when they haven't had that access. And I especially want to acknowledge those Melburnians like Ellen who have been stuck in or got into second lockdown, and that's really had a major impact on people and businesses and everything. So a big shout out to all those parents who are looking after kids and trying to work and do all the things they do. Timing is everything, and we are in the middle of a local government election campaign. The ballot arrives next week, and New Zealand's in an election campaign, and the US is in election campaigns. It's like democracy's breaking out everywhere. So timing is everything, and once we get a new council elected in October, we get pretty quick smart onto setting a new council plan for the next 4 years. And we're now trying to position ourselves as the Greens in Moreland to make sure that we replace the 4 councillors out of the 11 we have in our city. And we've been accused of being a Greens-led council, and that's a badge of honour for me, because over about a third of all votes across Moreland, obviously it's very green in the south here where I am, but more green if you like in terms of voters, but the northern areas are also going greener, and so we have the largest proportion of votes. Labor only gets around about 20-something%, is the next biggest chunk of votes. So I'm very proud to be leading that charge, because people vote for us and they want us to do these sorts of things. So I just want to touch on some of the headline things that we are doing around our zero carbon and climate emergency measures. Our zero waste by 2030 is also really important to today's discussion. And I want to touch a little bit on our Moreland integrated transport strategy, our food security, food system strategy, and then our open spaces and urban forest plans, as well as our nature plan, because many of these things are very hard to separate. And Eugenie's presentation kind of highlighted that for me, and Alan's is to a large degree as well. So just by way of background, in the carbon emission space, Council's done a lot of work in establishing the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, at Crowlands, and we did that with the City of Melbourne and Darebin and a whole bunch of other cities and organisations to get renewable energy only being consumed by our council organisation. We've rolled out solar projects over the years and for businesses, and we provided environmental upgrade programs for that. We've also had one of the largest EV charging stations in networks in Melbourne and Australia, which we're pretty proud of. And we've just been able to add to that, along with environmentally sustainable design in our planning scheme, which is really important. We were helped introduce that a few years ago, and that's having good outcomes for the kind of issues Alan raised with around thermal efficiency and so on. You know, I can sit in my house at the back here, an old Brunswick house, because the back part's been turned thermal, but the front bit where I am now is like a freezer. And in wintertime, I can sit in the back part without using the fire during wintertime, just about every day of winter. Only occasionally I have to light the fire. So that's really essential to affecting people's outcomes and fuel bills. So the other thing we've done in terms of addressing the climate emergency, we've just employed quite a few officers to help us get the whole community to zero carbon by 2040. Perhaps not as soon as some of us would like, but it's certainly a good target to work through, and we've got a lot of work to get to that. So in the plans for our next council, we've already started to improve our environmental sustainable design initiative through our planning scheme, because it's only around 5, 6 stars at the moment. We want to get that up into the sort of 8.5 star area, so that new builds will actually be much more efficient as we get into a warming planet. In the transport area, we've been doing a lot of work around supporting riding and walking, and all of that is really important in terms of what we're doing around nature and canopy cover. We've also been investing in a renewable energy EV fleet for our own transport needs, electric vehicle, I should say. And we've also been advocating strongly to really get better public transport services in terms of frequency, reliability, and hours of service, because it really impacts on the way we live. But in the planning space for that, we're also working to get much more shade and canopy for people who are walking. And under COVID, that's something that we're all trying to alleviate and make. It's become much more apparent how much we need to do more in these spaces. We're trying to reduce congestion and the reliance on private cars by using our transport strategy and our parking strategies to sort of use those as levers to promote social transport and public transport. And we're also putting a price on parking your car, so that if you want to be a new resident, which is what's happening under Victoria's planning scheme, you have to. If you want to live here, you're welcome to come, but we'd really like you to consider coming without a private car. And if you're going to have a private car, then please pay to park it off the street, and that will cost you maybe $60,000 to $80,000. And so we're really encouraging people to come without cars and to build new apartments and save that money by not having to house or build a bedroom to put your car in. I'm coming up to the waste thing, but the nature plan is something that we've done in this term, and around that we're looking to phase out glyphosate in the next year or two. We're going to then be relying on other methods to look after our weed management. We're planting 5,000 new trees and caring for them every year now in this term, and we're now looking at trying to address the major loss of trees on private land. And in this election, we're looking to announce, like Darebin did recently, a rewilding initiative where we're going to be providing plants and things and trees and so on for people to keep rewilding their gardens to counter that loss due to urban renewal and new developments. So coming to the waste side of it, in the waste space, we've got a target of 2030 as being our zero target. So we've only got less than 9 years to be doing that now, and we've incentivised our bin system so that people are paying for smaller bins and putting less waste and recycling into that system. But we've also been trying to encourage people to compost more and to community compost. And we've now started to actually, as of last year, just over a year ago, started to put our food waste in the garden organics bin, our bright green lidded bin. So we've got 3 bins in Moreland currently. So there's the recycling bin, the garden waste bin and the landfill bin. And the state government's promising a glass bottle bin in the next, well, can start from now, but has to be in place in the next 2 years, which is a great thing. That will be important. It's got its challenges in terms of some of the smaller properties, but we'll do that. And we've also taken a strong stance about burning waste to energy as a city, and we've refused any pyrolysation and any of that process, so that we've got a very clear direction for our officers, and that plays out with our procurement policies and all through the practices and the way the organisation runs. We've introduced a plastic wise policy to reduce single-use plastic reliance. So all of our festivals are now along those lines, and we're trying to get businesses to join us in that charge. We're putting, more water outlets so you can refill your water bottle and not have to buy water and all those kinds of initiatives. And we're rolling that out with our sporting clubs as well, because we can impact those, because they have arrangements to use our grounds, and we try and use that as a lever to get them to come on to supplying free water rather than having people pay for water at their tuck shops and things like that. So we're about to go into a fortnightly collection of landfill, so reducing the amount of landfill and maximising the amount of food going into the garden organics bin by picking that up weekly. At the moment, I have to freeze my food for a week because it only gets picked up every fortnight, and then I put it in the bin so it doesn't go too smelly between now and then. And you can also put animal products in there for those still on the animal, consuming animal food, based foods. And that's about to go through a big process of education and getting compliance happening. And we'll also be trying to accommodate the new purple glass bin by 2022. And that's all about getting us to a much more circular economy. So just to finish up, in terms of what we're trying to do in the next iteration of council, so hopefully we get our 4 councillors, or we probably won't get more than that, but we'll certainly want to get them all back. We want to try and get a recycling facility established here, or at least in the region, which aligns with the Green New Deal that Alan outlined earlier. That's really important if we're going to get this circular economy going. We can't do it without those kind of localised or regionalised initiatives. We want to repair. We've tried repair shop cafes in the past. We want to go back there, and we're going to keep doing it until we can make it last and work, and perhaps even have a tool library. And these will be where some jobs are involved, and training and sharing of skills, and people reusing and refixing things rather than just having to recycle them or dump them. We're also, I mentioned the Plant This City initiative recently, where we're going to have, thanks Alan, sorry, have our rolling out more shrubs and trees in the private realm, because the greatest loss of tree loss is on the private realm, and we're wanting to try and counter that by encouraging people to rewild their gardens. And that fits in with our nature plan, where we're really looking to try and minimise the impact on our species loss, the extinction threats that we're really facing. And we've seen how urban environments can actually bring birds back. We've had the kingfisher return here. We've had other successes with the blue-banded bee recently. And there are things we can do in our own gardens, in our own control, and across the city to help do that. So all of those things are going to be good for new jobs, stewardship jobs, leadership, training, and so on. So all of these initiatives are going to rely on the community, but we're wanting as a council to make sure that we're providing the leadership and the support and the advice, and the guidance, and to create that culture of really stewarding the land and learning from the Indigenous people in the way that we have sort of dismissed that for many decades and centuries in Australia, and we're now just recently starting to value and care for that. We've started a Nurrak Women's Caring for Country program in this council term. And that's a joint initiative from about 10 councils. But jointly you can create these. This is the advantage of working together and collaborating. We know that as Greens, as cooperating, collaborating, and taking initiatives like this, we can get really good outcomes. We want to use that wisdom and knowledge to spread that across the city further, and our neighbours in Darebin are doing the same. We've got the Ceres Environment Park, which is a lot of education and plant propagation, food production, and we'll be partnering with them and other organisations in our city to make sure that happens, and to get that food recycling into our city and building up our gardens rather than putting it into landfill and sending it up to some of the worst methane emissions you can do in your landfill. So we're going to continue to partner with people. We're going to need to learn and work with each other as a community, as residents and as visitors to Moreland. We want to use technology and the tools at our fingertips to make sure we're working as well as we can to really avoid the crisis that the climate emergency is having on us, and of course the crisis that we're having in waste at the moment, which Alan and Eugenie have also really referred to. So they're just some of the things that we're really hoping to get extra jobs and work coming out of that, and getting businesses and our procurement streams lined up so that they can take advantage of those changes as well. Thanks, Ellen. I'll leave it there and come back to questions.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. It's great to see at a local level what can be achieved. Sometimes we all get very despondent and despairing when we have a federal government who doesn't even really believe that climate change is happening, but we know that this action is actually happening on the ground, and it's so often being led by Greens councillors such as yourself. And just a reminder out there that your ballots for the local government election should be arriving between the 6th and the 8th of October, so very soon. Make sure that you take that seriously, make sure you vote, make sure you get your friends, neighbours, family to vote, and vote Greens to make sure that this kind of work continues. I just wanted to talk very briefly before we go to questions about what we're doing at a state level in terms of recycling. So you would remember that not very long ago, China created a bit of a crisis. Well, the crisis already existed, but China stopped taking our recycling, and that made us realise that we should have been dealing with it at home this entire time, and it created a bit of a crisis in government. And the Greens were able to use our numbers in the Victorian Parliament to get a parliamentary inquiry. We ran a great campaign and was successful in getting that parliamentary inquiry up. And what happened then is that set the wheels in motion for the government to have this inquiry, and it put a lot of pressure on them internally, particularly in the Labor Party, to do more on waste. And because of that inquiry, the government ended up announcing a few things, including a container deposit scheme, the 10-cent cash for cans scheme in Victoria, finally. So that was because of that pressure and that inquiry, and also this new 4-bin system. So we'll now be taking glass out of our normal bins and putting them into a new purple bin very soon, so that that glass can definitely go and get recycled. And it means that glass doesn't then go smash on paper, for example, and the paper can't be recycled. So separating out that waste is very important in terms of making sure it actually gets recycled. But we know we need to go further, and we actually need, many reports have shown there'll be a significant shortage in the next 5 years of recycling factories. Now that we're separating our waste, great, but now we actually need to recycle it. So the Greens have a costed plan that we've had independently costed to build 23, which is the number we need, 23 new recycling factories in Victoria, creating 760 new long-term jobs. So that would be something that, again, the government could invest in right now in the October budget, and we're asking them to do so, to make sure that we're not only creating jobs but actually dealing with the waste crisis. And we also believe that we need to do more in terms of banning single-use plastics. It was a Greens campaign that the government finally bowed to in terms of banning single-use plastic bags in Victoria. So that was great, but we do need to go further. So if you'd like to help out with any of this, there's a few things that you can do. So you can volunteer for the local government elections in Victoria, and that link is on your screen, and we'll put it in the chat. You can also sign up to make sure that you're kept updated with the Extinction Parliamentary Inquiry. That's what I was talking about earlier, about making sure that we have the resources and the laws in Victoria to protect our endangered species. So I've got the link there as well. And of course, vote Greens in the New Zealand elections if you can, or the Victorian local government elections if you can. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that I can have a look at all of your wonderful questions, but we will put these links in the chat if you haven't saved them. Now, let me just have a look while I've been yabbering away. Okay. Let me have a look. I'm just going through some of the questions here.
Ellen, while you're doing that,
Yes.
Can I just add something? I've just noticed in the chat a concern around the compliance in our bin system. And in Eugenie, you may not realise, but all of our councils have slightly different systems. Some of them are similar or very similar, but across Australia, it's completely sort of locally. And it's straight there when they move because they have to relearn and so on. So this is a really big challenge. And I know Alan put up the headline issues, but just to the concern in the chat, Alan, I think one of the things that we're doing more is we've slowed our rollout of our new bins, partly because we know how much the behaviour change is important, and partly because we know the lack of compliance at the moment is just shocking. I mean, we're not very good, even in our household here, and we're meant to be sharp about it, but it's a real challenge for us. And I just want to acknowledge that, Alan, as being one of the really big things. We talk about code, we see what behaviour change is like. It's really difficult for us as humans, and we have to do that in a way that's successful and long term. So when the purple bin arrives and when we start doing our weekly collection of the food organics and the garden organics, it's really important that we use that as an opportunity to get people to do the right thing and use the right bin and so on.
Absolutely. Yeah, very good point, Mark. And as part of that recycling inquiry, the government has also committed to money for an education campaign when those 4 bins come in. Whether they'll do it well or not, that remains to be seen, and we'll keep tabs on that. But absolutely, I think it's so confusing what you can put in your bins, and we could increase recycling just by a bit of education. So I've got a good question here from Karen. Thanks, Karen, for your questions. Congratulations, Eugenie, on your achievements in Aoteroa. Please tell us more about what the public support looks like for your initiatives on nature, and has there been any opposition, particularly given you have more people living outside of cities? Karen's wondering if this makes a difference.
Kia ora, Karen. So what has been really amazing is that because a lot of our Indigenous species are endemic, but like many of Australia's only found in Aoteroa, and because they're really threatened by rats, stoats, ferrets, there's been a huge upsurge in groups wanting to trap them to protect kiwi, to ensure that we have native birds back in our cities. And we've got an aspiration, which was started under the last government, of predator-free Aotearoa by 2050. So quite a chunk of the Jobs for Nature funding is going into landscape scale predator control. And that's usually cooperation between the regional councils, the local Indigenous people or iwi, and a lot of community groups that are using trapping. And I note some of the other comments in the chat about humane methods. Any traps have to go through animal ethics committees before they're approved. And as part of the increased funding for nature, we've also been investing in new lures, new trapping methods, and a real emphasis on ensuring that these are humane. But it's been these community trapping groups, and then people starting because they want to give nature a helping hand. They want to help our native bird species in particular, and then realising that they're connecting with a lot of their neighbours. So people start for nature, but it really helps build stronger, more resilient communities by the connections that are established locally. So there's been a lot of support for that. Where there's been some opposition is where, as a Green Minister, I've moved to control Himalayan tahr, which are a big mountain goat-like animal that really eat a lot of our threatened plants in the central southern Alps. And the hunting community has opposed that, and it's been quite a polarised debate. But really admire Melbourne's tree cover initiative and the comments that Mark was making about the need to re-establish trees on private land. We've got that same challenge in our major cities, and that's something we haven't managed to do this election, but I think there's a lot of support, public support, for having some of the rewilding policies that you're proposing. So I might take that idea back. Kia ora.
Thanks, Eugenie. There's another one here for you just in regards, it's from Jason, who'd like to know a bit more about whether New Zealand has made any progress with plastic recycling to keep plastics out of the environment. I know you talked a little bit about plastic bags, but would you like to say anything more about other plastics?
Yeah, so that's we a bit like Australia. That's why new infrastructure is really important. And China's National Sword Initiative, as with Australia, reminded us that we should be processing more at home. We've got the facilities onshore for number one, that sort of beverage containers, and not number two, which is our milk bottles, but that's coming. Number five, which is things like ice cream containers, that's coming. But some of those other plastics, which are really hard to recycle, we are looking at potentially phasing some of those out, like also expanded polystyrene, PVC. We're doing public consultation at the moment on phasing those out. And one of our mandatory product stewardship scheme proposals, which means that everybody's got to take responsibility for the waste they produce at the end of its life, is focused on plastic packaging. And there's quite a lot of support coming from across councils and the industry for some of those less valuable plastics, which are quite hard to reprocess, like 3s, 4s, 6 and 7, to actually not have them used in packaging, so that we focus on the higher value plastics, which can be shredded, washed, and then pelletized and reused. So we've still got a long way to go in the plastics area.
Wonderful, thank you. And Joss, had a question here as well about the soft plastic recycling capacity in New Zealand. So I don't know if you want to talk more about that.
The industry did start a scheme for that, had quite significant government funding under the last government, but it failed, and that's one of the plastics I think we have to move to potentially phase out.
Thank you, appreciate that. So I had a question here from Angela. I'd like to hear from Ellen, that's me, thank you, what you're doing on invasive species here in Victoria, for example, feral deer, still a protected species here in Victoria. Yes, so as I mentioned, I'm incredibly passionate about weeds and invasive species because it is such a huge issue here in Victoria. And even just in the last few years, we've seen an explosion in particularly feral deer populations across really sensitive areas, including our high country, which have had that double whammy of being smashed by fire and now smashed by invasive species. And when you have a fire go through, often the invasive species come back first because you're opening up the forests and they can go in and eat all the emerging plants that are coming up. And so they can inhibit that regeneration as well. So feral deer are a huge issue. They are still listed as a protected species here in Victoria, which just blows your mind. We have moved in Parliament several times to remove that protection, but the government hasn't agreed as yet. The government has had a few programs in terms of controlling invasive species. They're not always popular, as Eugenie mentioned, so there's people who instead would like to send the shooters and fishers would like to send amateur hunters into our national parks to get those deer, but there's a lot of problems with that because sending amateur hunters in is a real animal welfare issue because then often might just shoot something in the leg or unfortunately not lethal, and therefore you've got a lot of injured animals running around and they don't do a very good job, and we think it's a much more humane way to do it. But the government just hasn't put enough scale of funding into invasive species. They just do little things here and there, and they are a bit beholden to those shooters and fishers. And so we need a lot more funding in this area. And we've got a bit of a plan of what are the top things that they need to do. But really what it does need is actually just a lot of money and a very large scale government funded program. And now that we need the jobs, and particularly jobs for young people, there is that opportunity to send them out to do some of that training and some of that weeding. So I'm happy to talk more if you want to email my office anytime. I'm office@ellensandell.com, and I'd love to talk in more detail about some of the more detail in that environmental programs. Okay, I think we've got time for one more. Let me just have a check. We'll do two more. So one is from Papari, who says, is there any project for waste to energy plants here in Victoria? Yes, unfortunately there are several projects that private industry would like to build to burn our recycling and burn our waste here in Victoria. The Greens are very much opposed to it because it does release toxics into the atmosphere and very bad for people's health. We've actually been able to stop a couple of those projects along with the community, which is good, but it is a looming threat. And so make sure you just keep an eye out for that. We'll be doing some more communications on that. We're very happy that we've been able to stop a few of them, but they keep rearing their ugly heads, unfortunately. Let me just check if I can find one more question. One from Jane here, which is probably for you, Mark. Can councils ban new gas connections in domestic renovations and new builds?
Sorry, I was in the middle of typing.
What can councils do in
yes,
terms of getting us off gas now we know how dirty and destructive
yeah, well,
gas?
thanks. That's a great question, because this new initiative under our planning scheme is to get use the planning scheme 2.0 that we're doing with our CASB councils. And some councils don't know what that means, but it's to try and actually skip gas use. In fact, we have buildings going up in Moreland now that are actually meeting that requirement. It's not a requirement. So we're aiming for that now, which is great. Trying to use the planning to do that. And just to refer to someone else's question, Alan, around our apartment designs, some of the, I don't like that expression, but the fact that some of the, we in the last council prior, for we had standards for our apartments, and the government took those and
Mark, sorry, you're breaking up a bit, so we might have to cut you off. Your internet's not very good, so maybe if you could just type the answer to that one in the chat, that might be wonderful. And I've got just one last one here from Rob. Eleanor Green's exploring options for collaborating with hunters and fishers on feral species management. Differences of opinion clearly run deep, but what kind of collaboration has been done? Yes, we are collaborating all the time with lots of different groups. Happy to talk more offline, Rob, if you email us, office@ellensandell.com. But the important thing here is that we want to make sure that any program is actually effective at controlling invasive species, and also as humane as possible. And unfortunately, if we send in recreational hunters, there's a lot of evidence that shows that it's not only terrible for animal welfare, but also doesn't actually do the job we need it to do. But we actually have been talking a lot to professional pest management and professional shooting organisations that we work quite closely with around how we can use them and their skills to make sure that we have effective programs. So absolutely. And also, obviously, sorry, just adding, we also need a lot more investment in non-lethal methods as well. And there's virtually no government money going into those research projects into how we can actually have non-lethal methods, so we're not having to rely on lethal methods. Eugenie.
It's really interesting because the issues are exactly the same in New Zealand, and there's been a huge explosion in deer numbers, and the public just don't recognise what a threat they are to the forests. I've been in a forest where the deer were so hungry that they were ring-barking the trees and they just completely browsed out the understory. But until the public understand about the explosion in deer numbers in recent years, and we've got the social licence to control them, that can become quite a polarising debate. So we're trying to do the same here, work alongside deer stalkers, recognise that it's an important recreational asset, but we do need a coordinated strategy to actually control them and bring their numbers down. So I think there's a lot of learning across the Tasman, and we're also benefiting from your work on feral cats, because we've got a big feral cat problem as well. And again, the public don't, we've got a way to go and people understanding that.
Thanks. Well, that's all we've got time for. I just want to put a plug in again that please let all your New Zealand Kiwi friends know that the election is open and that New Zealanders living in Australia can vote. And if we want to keep seeing this kind of incredible work happening in New Zealand, we need a strong Greens voice at the heart of that government. You can party vote Green, and you can re-elect a Labor government, but with some Greens ministers in there, a Greens heart. So please do that. And of course, we need more Greens councillors right across the state, not just in our inner city areas, but we have many, many Greens running in regional areas, right the way from, we've got them from Mildura right through to Surf Coast, Mildura right through to Malakuta. Pretty much the entire state we have Greens running. So having more Greens in rural and regional councils also very, very important in terms of making sure that we're protecting, conserving, and regenerating our beautiful landscapes. So thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions following this, just email my office@ellensandell.com, and we'll put a couple more links in the chat, please, Fern, just in terms of how you can sign up to hear more about the inquiry into extinction that we're doing and how you can volunteer for the local government elections. So thanks everyone for joining me, and in particular thanks to Mark and Eugenie for sharing your wisdom and for all the incredible work that you do. Have a good afternoon, everyone.